Tell them what you want, peace. Everybody needs peace. Everybody wants peace. Everybody needs peace. Everybody scream. American English. American English. American English. Webinar series. Teach and learn. American English webinar series.
Hello from Washington, D.C., and welcome to American English Webinar Series 2, brought to you by the American English team, the U.S. Department of State, and embassies all over the world. So welcome teachers from around the globe. Here you can see a picture of our teachers gathered in Indonesia. So a special welcome to Indonesia and welcome to all the teachers from around the world. My name is Jenny, part of the American English team, also known as Moderator Jenny. You'll also see my friends Moderator Katie and Moderator Heather in the chat box to help you. We've had a few changes since our previous webinar series. The program is now called the American English Webinar Series. You might have known it as Shaping the Way We Teach English, but don't worry, you can still expect the same great sessions that you're used to. Now our webinars will be just 60 minutes long. In some of the previous ones they were 90, but now they're just 1 hour long. What's most exciting about our new American English webinar series is that each month the webinars will be related to a very specific topic that you can find on our American English website in the Teacher's Corner. So in addition to this webinar, you'll find lots of resources related to this topic. So here you can see the American English Webinar Series 2. Today is our first webinar of 2016, so we're very excited. Making learning fun, interactive activities to build student motivation and engagement in your classroom. And here you can see the rest of the schedule that will go through March. So during these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter, just as you can hear me now. And the way for you to participate is to ask questions and make comments related to today's topic in the chat box. We may not be able to answer everyone's question, as there's often hundreds of teachers from all around the world joining us, but there is a way for you to ask questions after the session is over. Your presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls, and those will be multiple choice questions that appear on the screen. And finally, we know that you may experience some technical problems, and unfortunately we cannot fix individual issues, but we will let you know if we're having a global problem. But if you do lose sound, a great way to follow along is by watching the caption pod that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. So as most of you probably know, if you attend at least 4 out of the 6 webinars in each course, you will receive an e-certificate from your U.S. Embassy. So please be sure to submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. So at the very end, we will give you a link to follow, and that's how you will submit your attendance. If you're watching the webinar with a group, then we'll also ask you to submit the number of people in your group. So we hope that most of you are already familiar with our Ning site, but if you haven't registered, you can join this site by going to AmericanEnglishWebinars.com. And here's where you can find the resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, both before and after each session. And finally, we hope that you visited our American English website, americanenglish.state.gov. This is where you'll find lots of teaching resources for your classroom, and your students can also visit this website for learner resources. And this is where you'll find the Teacher's Corner, with the topic this month, Making Learning Fun. So now for today's session, making learning fun, interactive activities to build student motivation and engagement in your classroom. In this webinar, the presenter will show you how to spark your students' intrinsic motivation in the English language classroom, outline tips for engaging your students in a meaningful way, and present several student-approved activities that can turn even the dullest lesson into something fun. Please raise your hand if you don't like fun. So I think this webinar will be for everyone because I don't see any hands raised. And our presenter today is Amy Rich, who's going to talk about all of this fun. Amy has worked in the TESOL field for over 12 years, both in the US and abroad. She's taught in Japan, Kenya, Italy, Ireland, Morocco, Tibet, Israel, Palestine, and served as an English language specialist in Amman, Jordan. Amy is currently working as a moderator for the American English webinar series and also produces the post-webinar videos. Welcome, Amy. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thanks so much for your introduction, Jenny. Welcome, teachers from around the world. I'm very excited to be with you here today as a presenter to talk about making learning fun by using interactive activities to build student motivation and engagement in your classroom. So before we get started with my presentation, let's take a look at one of our pre-webinar poll results. I asked you, how do you engage your students in the classroom? And you guys had a bunch of options here. It looks like most of you ask your students to share their opinions and get to know their interests. About 50% of you show that you respect them and you cultivate trust with them. And only about a fourth of you allow them to make decisions about coursework. So I'll be explaining a little more how you can include them on some of the classroom decisions a little later. And also I'll explain some specific ways to engage your students a little later. But for now, let's get started by looking at today's goals. Today I will identify factors that increase student motivation. I'll equip you with tips for engaging your students. And I'll share interactive activities that can motivate your students to learn. Now, speaking of motivating your students to learn, what does the word motivation mean to you? Feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box right now. So what does motivation mean to you? Something interesting, something that gets your students interested in class, connecting the teacher with the students. Okay. Victoria from Russia says desire, something that's encouraging. Excellent. These are all really good answers. Engagement, raising awareness. Okay, encouraging students to achieve a goal by enjoying what they are doing. Excellent answer. All right, good job, guys. Well, motivation is defined as a force or influence that causes someone to do something. So it's an internal process that makes a person move towards a goal. When we talk about motivation in schools, we're generally talking about our students' motivation to learn. So, what do we know about motivating our students? Well, we know that higher student motivation leads to higher student engagement. And that higher student engagement results in higher achievement, better understanding of concepts, more satisfaction with school, and a lower dropout rate. We also know that there are two types of motivation, intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Do you know what the difference is? Let's go back to the chat box. In a moment, you'll see two columns in the chat box, one labeled intrinsic motivation and one labeled extrinsic motivation. under each label, write down some examples of each type of motivation. So I'm looking for examples of intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So let's start with some of the intrinsic motivation answers. Some samples of intrinsic motivation. Students willing to learn. Inner motivation, perfect. Praise helps intrinsic motivation. Love of the language. Interest, personal growth, passion. Excellent. Great answers, guys. I think you've got it. Now, how about extrinsic motivation? How about some samples of that? Stickers. Yep. Rewards. Good grades. Okay. Games. Yes, I think you guys are on to it. Praising, certificates, excellent. Excellent, excellent. Great. You've hit upon many good points. And now I will outline these terms a little more in detail. So, what I want you to pay close attention to is the reason for a student's effort depending on the type of motivation I talk about. Are you guys ready? So, we'll start with intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the natural curiosity and desire to learn that we're all born with. So, when your students engage in a behavior or perform an activity because it is personally rewarding, they are being intrinsically motivated. This could be when they participate in a class game because they find it enjoyable, or when they compete in a class contest because they like the challenge. Yeah, a lot of you gave these examples. Excellent. Now, extrinsic motivation is when we perform a behavior or engage in an activity in order to receive an external reward. Someone mentioned stickers earlier. So this is when your students study in order to receive a good grade or when they compete in a class contest to win a prize. Again, their motivation to try is to receive something for their effort. All right. Now that I've outlined these two types of motivation in more detail, let's go to the polls. So, I want to know which type of motivation, intrinsic or extrinsic, do you think leads to higher student engagement in the classroom? So which one leads to higher student engagement in the classroom? All right. The majority of you are going with intrinsic motivation. Yes, okay. Those of you who said intrinsic motivation are right. However, I must tell you that in the past, it was believed that the best way to motivate young people was through extrinsic rewards. This idea was based on experiments done with animals in which animal behaviors could be manipulated by rewarding treats. As a result, parents and educators alike have relied heavily on the use of extrinsic rewards such as grades, gold stars, money, and praise to motivate learners. I have to admit, I'm also very guilty of giving out extrinsic rewards in the past. Remember, when our students are extrinsically motivated, they participate because they expect an outcome like a reward. More recently, though, researchers have found that people do not just passively respond to their environments, that actually people have an innate desire to learn for the sake of learning, that they are motivated to learn because they find learning enjoyable, they're passionate about learning, or they just like the challenge. It is stimulating our students' intrinsic motivation, their passion for learning, that I will focus on throughout my webinar. Why? Because research shows that when students work on a task for intrinsic reasons, it's not only more enjoyable for them, but it also facilitates higher learning and achievement. So, just how can we ignite our students' internal desire to learn? Well, first I'm going to share my 4 tips for cultivating intrinsic motivation in your students, And after, I'll show you some activities you can do with your students to better engage them both inside and outside of your classroom. All right, so my first tip for cultivating intrinsic motivation in your students is to create a healthy learning environment. So let's go to the chat box. Tell me, what do you do to try to create a healthy learning environment in your classroom? What do you do to create a healthy learning environment in your classroom? Okay, you don't judge your students. Games, you keep things stress-free. You laugh and have fun. You're open. Okay, and you make things friendly and positive and safe. Really, really good answers, guys. Well, I'm going to outline some important tips right now for building a healthy environment. You can start by building good relationships with your students. Get to know them early, learn their names by using icebreakers, and also get to know their parents. In the US, for example, parental support is directly linked to student engagement and learning among African American and Latino youth. So, provide opportunities for parents to collaborate. Invite them to performances, class presentations, show and tell, etc. Cultivate trust. Let students make decisions and help them feel comfortable asking questions. Show students that asking questions is not only okay, it's also expected. Also, offer them your support and encouragement. Studies have found that students who felt their teachers were supportive and cared about their success were more likely to be engaged in the classroom and perform better. And this is a big one for cultivating trust. Never ridicule a student's confusion or make fun of an incorrect response. If you do, you may never regain their trust. Now, one side note about trust. Always remember that you are an authority figure to your students, and that while building trust does include being friendly with students, it does not mean you should act as a student's friend. Indicate interest. Make eye contact, use nonverbal cues, give insightful feedback, and encourage students to respond to each other. Also, create an environment that embraces your students' own backgrounds and cultures. This shows your interest in them. And finally, help your students to believe in themselves by focusing on your students' strengths. Explain to them individually how they can improve. Emphasize their effort rather than their intelligence. Why should we do this? Well, studies show that when you praise a student for being intelligent, they can begin to fear that making a mistake will cause them to lose their intelligence status. So it's better to praise a student's effort. This will encourage them to learn through their hard work. My second tip for cultivating intrinsic motivation in your students is to figure out what your students are into. Do you know this idiom? To be into something? What I mean is, what do your students like? What are they passionate about? Let's go to the chat box. Think about your students. What are they into? What do they like? Football, music, songs, lots of music and sports I'm seeing. Dancing. So many answers so quickly, it's hard for me to read them. Wow. Okay, great stuff. History, excellent. Role plays, fashion, perfect, guys. Computers. Well, it looks like you guys are pretty in touch with your students' interests. But if you're not sure what they're into, make an effort to discover their interests. You can simply ask them, hey, what are you into? Like I just did with you. Or facilitate a creative activity to find out what they like, such as student-to-student interviews, 2 truths and a lie, bingo, and so on. So why does it matter what they're into? It matters because if the topics you choose to present in your classroom are meaningful to them, they're going to be way more interested in the material and more engaged. It's simple. So, once you've discovered what your students are into, what they're passionate about, then try incorporating those interests into your lesson. For example, if your students like sports, like most of yours do, I can see, select materials related to sports that they might not know much about, such as extreme sports or daredevils. Are your students into social media? Well, use this knowledge to make your lesson plans more dynamic. Instead of having students write a reflection for homework that only you will read, you could ask them to contribute to your class Facebook page by sharing their thoughts in the comments section of your post. This is far more interactive than writing a reflection, as students can respond to each other's thoughts, which might even bring forth some healthy debates. Now, if you don't use Facebook with your students, don't worry. Here's another option for you. Have your students write the reflections in their journals, and after, you can have them exchange their journals with another student and write responses to each other's entries. And finally, we've come to my fourth tip. Take student involvement a step further by allowing students to make some choices in the classroom. Now, it looks like only about a fourth of you allow your students to make choices in the classroom, so I'm going to give you some examples of how you can do that a little bit. Engaging students in the learning process helps to increase their attention, focus, motivates them to use critical thinking skills, and promotes meaningful learning experiences. So, how can we better engage them? Well, you can let your students make choices about class rules, goals, content, and homework. You can allow them to share their expectations related to the course content. You can teach students to reflect and take control over their own learning by using weekly reflections that allow them to give feedback on their own performance and where they feel they can improve. And finally, you can empower students by showing them where they can access additional resources online that might help them in those areas they feel they need to improve. So, now you know my 4 tips for cultivating intrinsic motivation in your classroom. Let's put them into action. For the rest of my webinar, I'll present engaging activities I've often used in the classroom that incorporate these 4 tips. I hope you find some of these activities helpful in igniting your students' passion to learn. But before we start, let's go to the polls. Okay. What do you do in your classroom to motivate your students to learn? Do you sing songs, play games, use the internet, use technology, show short films, all of the above? All right. Most of you are playing games with your students. That's great. All right. What else? And it looks like about half of you are doing almost everything else. Okay, so I really like that you guys are playing games. That's a huge motivator. And a lot of you are using technology. That's really great because I'm about to talk about some fun technology-based activities you can use in your classroom. So, for those of you who don't have access to technology in your schools, don't worry. I'll present many non-tech based options too. But first, let's look at motivating our students through technology. So, if you're hoping to motivate your students intrinsically with something that they will truly enjoy, using technology is probably the best place to start. Let me tell you, the moment I bring technology into my classroom, my students' faces brighten up. So take a look at this list of different types of technology. You can see that I've included here on this slide. Most of you are probably familiar with these items, but do you know how to incorporate them into your classroom? From my own experience working with teachers, many are a little intimidated by the thought of using technology in their classrooms, or they don't quite know how to incorporate it. So, raise your hand if the thought of using technology in your classroom makes you nervous. I see many of you raising your hands. You know, I remember when I first started using technology in the classroom years ago, it really scared me. But then I started using it a lot and I got used to it. So, don't worry, you guys are not alone. I hope I can help by giving you some fun and easy ideas for incorporating technology into your classroom. So, here's my first idea. Here's a really innovative activity you can do with your students that they will love. Many of your students own a smartphone and are familiar with using different types of apps. Since we're on the topic, let's go to the chat box. Tell me, which apps do you use? So I want to know which apps you use, the ones you use, not your students. I want to know what you use personally. Okay, Edmodo, WhatsApp, mobile learning, Facebook, Viber, YouTube, Quizlet. Ah, cool, you guys are using Quizlet. Lots of Facebooks in there. I'm seeing lots and lots of Facebook. What is Kahoot? Hassan uses Kahoot. I don't know that one. Duolingo. You guys are going crazy. You guys are really using your apps. Excellent. Okay. Well, a really fun way I incorporate technology concepts in my classroom is through an app competition activity, where teams work to create a new innovative app idea. And students, especially teenagers, love this one. So this is a fast-moving activity, but could be modified to last a little longer. How does it work? Well, I'm going to tell you. You can start by dividing your students into groups of 3 or 4 and give them about 10 minutes to brainstorm a concept for an app. So their idea should be original, or at least one they've never heard of. During this time, you can walk around, provide assistance, keep your students on topic, help them with vocabulary, encourage them, and make sure they've come up with an idea that is new. So, depending on your class, you can choose any length of time for each of the steps that I'm going to describe. So that first step is to brainstorm. Brainstorm a new app idea. Okay. After about 10 minutes of brainstorming, ask everyone to stop. Each group should now have their idea. Explain that they now have about 15 minutes to create a poster that includes their app name, an outline of what their app is and how it functions, and an app logo. While they're working, be sure to walk around, monitor, and provide assistance again. Okay, after about another 15 minutes, it's time to move into the presentation stage of the competition. And actually, if you look at some of these pictures here, you can see a couple of my students presenting. So you can give teams about 5 minutes to work on their oral presentations, and once ready, they're going to take turns presenting their app ideas to the rest of the class. And finally, after presentations, there is a vote. Each group must vote for the best app and cannot vote for themselves. To make sure teams aren't just voting for their friends, ask them to explain why they voted for the participant for that particular app. Now, I'm going to give you a few tips for facilitating this activity. So as a teacher, it's really important to pre-teach the word or concept of an app. Just like I did with you guys, you can ask, what's your favorite app? Or which apps do you use? This is also a very fast-moving activity, and it should be fast because that's what makes it fun. So make sure to set some strict time limits. And finally, you need to be constantly monitoring the groups to ensure they're sticking to the task. If you're not, you may run into trouble. All right. Raise your hand if you think you'll try that activity with your students. I really, really hope you do. I love that one. It's fun. Okay. My next Teaching with Technology activity is called Newspaper Hunt. Have you ever mentioned a newspaper activity to your students and watched their eyes glaze over? Do you know that idiom, when one's eyes glaze over? It's when someone's eyes look bored and sleepy. Well, if you'd like to get your students reading, specifically something culturally rich like a newspaper, here's a fun activity you can facilitate. Before class, choose an online newspaper source and make up several focus questions based on its front page articles. As you can see here, I've chosen Voice of America's online paper. Now, before you start panicking, do not worry. You don't have to be able to read the small print in this screen capture. I'm just using it as an example. Once in class, you can pair up your students and have them locate the online newspaper you've chosen. In order to answer the questions you've pre-created, your students will have to skim through the articles in the newspaper. So, you can see here some sample questions I've made for my newspaper hunt, such as, what's the temperature in Washington, D.C.? How many people were hurt in the California storm? What's the #1 pop song in America this week? And what movie is the top-grossing American movie ever? You can make the questions as easy or difficult as you'd like, depending on your student's language level. And without even knowing it, your students will be reading English, exposed to new vocabulary and American culture, and having fun. Here is a tip for you guys who might not have Wi-Fi or access to the internet. You can also do this exercise with real English newspapers. Just bring a few copies or photocopies into class. A great technology-based activity you can do with your students is to arrange for them to interview an expert in the field via any video app, such as Skype, Facebook, FaceTime, Google Hangouts. So, what do I mean by expert in the field? Well, just someone who knows about a particular topic. So, take a look at this picture here. You can see me on Skype with a bunch of children. Well, that's because I was an expert in the field for a 3rd grade class in Vermont, United States, that was learning about the Middle East. Since I was living in Jordan at the time, they wanted to ask me all sorts of questions. They stood in line and asked questions one by one, such as, are there camels in Jordan? What's the weather like? What holidays do people in Jordan celebrate? So, let's go to the chat box. I want to know, what are you an expert in the field on? So you can feel free to write real answers or silly answers. For example, I live in Italy right now, so I kind of feel like I'm an expert in the field in ice cream. Watching dramas, movies, Japanese culture, cars. Rasha, you're a Middle East expert. Me too. Cooking. The aquarium, sushi. Okay, great answers, guys. Now think about your students. What are they curious about? Why not connect them with an expert in the field? This is a great way to motivate your students to speak and practice how to ask questions in English. Here are a few more technology-based ideas for your classroom. So, if your students are not excited about writing assignments, use ePals to motivate them. Raise your hand if you've ever used ePals before. Okay, it looks like a bunch of you have. For those of you who don't know, an ePal is an email pen pal, so someone your student can write via email. ePals will give your students opportunities to practice their English in a meaningful way and also make new friends. This is certainly more motivating than writing a hypothetical letter and of course, great preparation for those future business emails they'll be writing. So, where can you find e-pals for your students? Well, most of us have fellow English teachers who work in different schools. Hey, look in the chat box. You have about 200 or 300 different options. Or maybe even in different countries. Take advantage of that by pairing up your students with their English students. If you can't find another English class to work with, you can post a request for e-pals on any ESL message board. But again, I want to encourage you guys to connect with each other, maybe in the Ning or over here in the chat box, and connect your class with another English class. How about music? So most of you said you do use music in your classrooms, and you probably have used gap fills before, where words are missing from song lyrics and your students must listen to the song in order to fill them in. But why not take it a step further? Inspire your students to write their own lyrics to a popular song. Tabitha Kidwell presented a great activity on making songs with students during last season's American English webinar series. It'll be available on the American English YouTube channel soon, so be sure to check it out. So, I'm sure almost all of your students are using social media. Take advantage of this. This is a great English learning opportunity. Encourage them to change their Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other social media profiles to English. Suggest they like pages and news sources in English so those things pop up into their news feed. This will maximize their English language exposure. Short films are another great tool to use in the classroom. I like to turn short films into critical thinking exercises. This is a really good activity for upper level classes, and two of my favorite short films available on YouTube are The Black Hole and The Gift, so be sure to check those two out. And finally, I think a lot of you probably saw Jeff Kuhn's amazing webinar last season on using podcasts in the classroom and making them with your students. I highly recommend you watch Jeff's two-part YouTube series, which is now available on the American English YouTube channel. Another way to motivate your students intrinsically is through the use of games. And I saw before when we looked at our pre-webinar lobby poll that almost all of you are using games. So I know that you're using games, but I'm curious, how often are you using them in your classroom? So let's go to the chat box. How often do you use games in your classroom? Yeah, often. Every week, almost every class. Okay, excellent. Playing games is a great way to motivate learners of any age, but the best type of games in English language classroom are those that challenge students while also allowing them to practice an English point. And when I say games, I don't mean video games. There is much you can do with good old classic games. So, my first using games activity is to play Jeopardy! For those of you who don't know, Jeopardy! Is a famous American TV show where contestants compete to answer trivia questions. Playing Jeopardy! Is a great way to review material you've used over the course of your class. You can create your own version for the classroom pretty easily. All you need is some paper, tape, and a wall. This is how it works. So before class, you'll need to create the trivia questions. You can choose 6 categories. Well, you can see mine here, and make up 5 questions for each category. So take a look at my questions column. Notice that the value of the questions increases. This is because the more difficult the question is, the more it's worth. So the question for 100 should be the easiest, and the one for 500 should be the most difficult to answer. Let's take a look at a question. So I'm going to show you a sample question here. Okay, American cities for 100. This American city is home to the Statue of Liberty. Do you know the answer, guys? You can answer in the chat box. New York, New York, New York. Yeah, you got it. Very, very good. So let's continue. You can divide your students into teams of 3 to 5, and each team should choose one team representative. This is the only person who's allowed to raise their hand to answer questions. One team starts by choosing a category and a dollar amount. So American Cities for 100 would be an example. The host reads the question, and the first team rep to raise their hand can answer. Teams play until all questions have been answered, and the team with the highest score wins. So board games are also a really, really fun way to introduce new vocabulary and review speaking points. They're also a welcome change from your regular speaking, reading, and writing exercise routine. Most of you probably know Jenga. I have a little picture here. A game where players try to remove wooden blocks from a stack and place them on top without tipping the stack over. So take a look here at my photo. It's really, really fun. I love playing this game in my classroom, but with a twist. I ask my students to write English questions on the blocks. So you can see what that looks like here. Now, when they take turns pulling out the blocks, they have to read the question on their block out loud and answer it before placing it back on the top of the stack. You can allow the questions to be topic-free, or you can zero in on a specific topic. For example, if you're teaching your students how to give advice in English, they might write questions like, "Which movie should I go see tonight?" Or, "What's the best way to stay in shape?" You can score the game any way you want. So I've got a tip for you. Actually, 2 tips. While your students are writing the questions, be sure to check all the blocks to make sure they're appropriate before the game begins. And also, have your students write on the blocks in pencil so they can easily be erased afterwards. Games are such a good intrinsic motivator, and there are tons of other great board games out there you can use in the ESL classroom. Let's go to the chat box. What games do you use? I'd like to know what games you guys are using in your classroom. Scrabble, Bingo, Hangman, Taboo. Taboo's pretty awesome. Life, Monopoly. These are wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, well, I'm a big fan of the games listed on this page, especially Activate, brought to you by the great team at American English. Activate offers several board games that will help your students learn American English in a fun, meaningful way. You can check out some example activities from my Ning discussion thread. So be sure to check out Activate if you haven't used it. Now, if you don't have access to these games, here's a tip for you. So if you guys don't have these board games in your country or your school doesn't have them, you can go online and there are printable versions available of most of these games, including Activate. So if you don't have access to these games and you don't have the internet, here's another idea for you. Why not have your students make their own board games like my students did here? This is a fabulous way to promote active learning, a topic I'm going to touch upon now. When students are passive, when they're not active, their brains don't do a very good job of processing or retaining information. According to some recent studies, a teacher says about 100 to 200 words a minute, and a student hears about 50 to 100 of those words. That's half. Worse yet, in a typical lecture-style class, students pay attention just 40% of the time. Those numbers are really low. We know that students learn best when learning is active. Active learning in the English classroom means that students are mentally involved with the language, that they discover, investigate, and interpret English, often through hands-on activities, like making a board game, for example. So, let's go to the chat box. How do you make your classrooms active? You play games. Okay. Use games, brainstorm, mingle. Okay, excellent. Yes, games are great. You can use role plays, use visuals such as film, PowerPoints, objects, photographs, cartoons, maps, newspapers. You can sing songs, use the internet, read books, and so on. Here are some specific activities I like to use in my classroom. Our students love to eat, and many of them even enjoy cooking. One of my favorite food activities to bring to the classroom is live cooking demonstrations. I do this because I like to give my students the opportunity to share about their home culture, and food is a big part of that. Presenting how to cook with real objects in the room, or realia, will make the learning experience more memorable for your learners, especially if they can see, touch, smell, and taste the food. In addition, they'll be able to practice food vocabulary and imperative statements. Here's a fun idea. Take anything that has to be built in steps and turn it into an exciting race. I took something really silly, a ring made out of a dollar bill, and challenged pairs of students to race to see who could make it first. You can see the finished product over here. There's a little red arrow pointing to it. Really cool, right? Well, my students thought it was really cool and were super motivated to make it. So here's how it works. Split your class into pairs, so partner A and partner B. Partner A and partner B should be placed on opposite ends of the room, and each end of the room should have a long table. So you can see I drew a little diagram here. So partner A is at table A, partner B is at table B. Partner A has the dollar bill at their table, so it's just a dollar bill right now. They are going to be the ring maker. They must stay at their table throughout the entire race. They cannot leave their table. Partner B has the instructions for making the dollar bill ring at their table. They are the instruction giver. They must move back and forth from their table to their partner's table, but the instructions must never leave their table. So partner B runs back and forth to partner A, delivering the instructions verbally. They must tell them the instructions. The first team to complete the ring wins. And you can see I've got a really proud team down here of 3 with their end product. If you guys have really big classes, you can turn this into more of a team activity. So maybe you'd have 2 people on a team making the ring and 2 people giving instructions for each team. So there's like 4 on a team. All right. Another active learning idea I have for you is really simple. Feed your students' interests. Well, what do I mean? Well, remember when you took the time to figure out what your students were into, what they're passionate about? I want you to literally feed those interests. Even the strangest interests can be turned into an active and engaging classroom lesson. For example, I had a class of teenage girls that were obsessed with painting their nails. I thought to myself, how in the world can I turn this interest into a class activity? Well, I decided to first create a critical thinking exercise about the history of nail polish. And after the lesson, I got hands-on with them. I had instructed each student to bring in nail polish color the day before. They were now allowed to take the nail polish out. I put out some step-by-step nail art instructions, and the girls paired up. Each pair took one set of instructions and helped create that design on their partner's nails. They had so much fun with our lesson on nails that after I saw them showing off their new designs and also quizzing friends about the origins of nail polish. So how about any other topic? Let's imagine your students are interested in yoga, and a lot of our students are. Feed their interest by having them research and make presentations on different aspects of yoga, such as its origins, different poses, health benefits, and after, you could arrange an actual yoga class that's instructed in English. This is a class they'll surely never forget. Respected linguists Stephen Crash and Tracy Terrell said the purpose of language instruction is to allow the learner to understand language outside of the classroom. So find ways to give students the opportunity to utilize their English skills outside of the classroom by sending them into the real world to practice what they've learned. Why should you do this? Because the language they encounter in the outside world is authentic. Students can see their own progress when they interact in an authentic setting, which can help them to develop confidence. And finally, sending students into the real world helps them become independent learners who can make use of the English community in their own time outside of class. Now you may be thinking to yourself, how can I expose my students to authentic English if I don't live in an English-speaking country? Now I'm going to give you some ideas for creating authentic get-out-of-the-classroom opportunities for your students. How about doing a photo scavenger hunt? This is a fantastic way to help your students build vocabulary and teach them about the history of different cultures. For a lower level class, you could focus strictly on vocabulary. So here's a little list I made. You could put your students into pairs or teams, each of them with their own camera or smartphone, and have them go around and take photos. The team that comes back first with all the photos is the winner. For a higher level class, you could use more abstract language. You can check out my list here for a more difficult class. For example, something spooky might depend on a student's own experience and interpretation of the concept of the word. Alternatively, you could come up with creative clues that your students must first solve and then take pictures of. So here are some examples. Here's another get out of the classroom idea for you. So if you see these pictures here, you look at these pictures, you can see that we are learning how to knit. So I actually was teaching my students about youth culture in Brooklyn, New York, and how activities that used to be uncool for young people had come into fashion again. And one of those activities is knitting. My students were fascinated by this and wanted to learn more. So I found a local yarn shop that was willing to talk to my students about knitting and teach them how to make basic stitches. This was an incredibly fun and memorable day. My students were exposed to new concepts, vocabulary, and they felt like they were part of the Brooklyn, New York youth culture movement. This experience also bonded us as a class, which noticeably raised enthusiasm in the classroom. So where else might you be able to take your students to be exposed to English? Well, I'm going to tell you. So does your town have an English-speaking community? Why not connect with them at a community center or on social media and set up a language exchange? For those of you who don't know, a language exchange is when native English speakers and foreigners meet and they exchange their language. So maybe for 30 minutes, the pairs or group will speak English, and for the other 30 minutes they'd speak the native language. Where else might... This is also a great way for your students to make new friends. How about a photo walk? Most of your students probably have phones that can take pictures. A photo walk is different from the photo scavenger hunt that we talked about earlier. It's not a competition. Its main purpose is for students to take pictures of things that interest him or her. So to make your photo walk engaging in English, take your students outside and ask them the names of things in English. This is a great opportunity for them to learn new vocabulary, perhaps related to nature, city life, etc. You can see some pictures my students took of the desert. Field trips are another great way to expose your students to authentic language and active learning. And also things such as concerts, poetry readings, movies, plays, anything where a native speaker might be present. Here's a tip. When I leave the classroom, I like to keep my students engaged by creating quiz sheets that they can fill out during their trip. By the way, I should mention that a field trip provides a great opportunity to try out that photo scavenger hunt. Some extension exercises you can do once you've returned to your classroom are presentations about the trip. You could arrange in advance for certain groups to focus on a particular aspect of your visit, Or they could make a travel guide advising others on the best way to enjoy the attraction. Or how about a podcast that discusses the places visited? Or an in-class debate that centers around the issues raised at a particular site. Now we're coming to the end of my webinar. I have presented several activities that I hope will challenge your students and capture their attention and curiosity. And I challenge you to take student engagement one step further by helping your students attain the intrinsic reward. I want them to be fully immersed in learning in an enjoyable and meaningful way. So how can you help them reach that intrinsic reward? Well, take the activities I've presented even further. For example, are your students proud of the photos they took on their photo walk? Don't stop there. Inspire your students to share their work with others by setting up an exhibition of their best photos with descriptions of the photos in English, like I did with my students here. Did your students have a blast creating their own lyrics to a popular song? This is the perfect opportunity to showcase their hard work. Arrange for them to perform in front of other classes, their parents, or even the public. Have your students created unique materials throughout the course of your class? Why not work on showing that off in a class magazine that incorporates their different talents, such as poems, songs, art, opinion pieces, jokes, and so on? And remember that app competition? Why not arrange to have your class help facilitate the app competition for a lower level English class? This type of inter-student interaction, where your students teach other students what they've learned, is mutually beneficial for your students and those they are teaching. In closing, I encourage you to work on cultivating a healthy learning environment for your students, one in which they feel safe, cared for, and engaged. And I challenge you to ignite your students' intrinsic motivation by trying out some of the activities I've outlined in my webinar. And as you as a teacher begin to experience those special moments when you know your students are making the connection between learning and their own lives, I promise that your own passion for learning will be ignited, and your commitment to teaching will become even stronger. Thank you all so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you and share. I hope you found this time useful, and I thank you kindly for your really thoughtful responses in the chat box. I'm looking forward to seeing you all over in the Ning later for some post-discussion. Bye!
All right. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for giving us some great ideas and tips for how to engage our students and build their intrinsic motivation by making learning fun. I also want to say a big thank you to everyone out there who participated today. You had some wonderful ideas in the chat box, and I'm sure you're going to continue an excellent discussion on the Ning after today's session. I saw some good questions in the chat box dealing with things such as large classes and different learner levels. Please, I encourage you to ask Amy and each other those types of questions on the Ning, either using the live chat on the home page or using the discussion forum. We do want to thank you again, and we look forward to learning with you during future webinars in this series. Our next webinar is going to take place right here on February 3rd, 2016, and the title is going to be The Flipped Classroom, Preparing Students for In-Class Learning with Online Activities, and our presenter is going to be Andrew Screen. It's going to be a great session, and we look forward to seeing you. All right, now it is time for an important aspect of our webinar, and that is taking attendance. Remember that you need to have attended 4 of 6 webinars to earn your e-certificate at the end of the series. Again, these certificates will be distributed by your local U.S. Embassy or Regional English Language Office. And so to record your attendance, we will need you to please go to the internet link listed here on the slide in the center of the screen, and that Katie is posting in the chat box for you. There's going to be some simple instructions that you will need to follow to submit your attendance information, and you'll only need to fill out this web form one time, please, just once. You're going to see something similar to the image here on the slide when you visit the website. Please make sure you take your time and enter the information correctly. If you're watching as an individual today, you'll just need to enter the number 1 in the box that asks for the total number of participants. If you're leading a viewing session, you're going to enter the number of people who are watching the webinar with you, and you'll also need to keep your own list of participants who are in the viewing group. You're going to send that list to your Regional English Language Office or local U.S. Embassy at the very end of the series in March. So again, please follow the web link that you see on the screen and that Katie will be entering. You don't need to enter 1 in the chat box. All the information will need to be entered on that web form. We're not going to be able to take any information that's entered in the chat box, so no numbers, no emails, no personal information in the chat box here, please. Please enter all of your information in the web form using the internet link shown on the screen. We do not need your email information. Please enter the requested information on the web form on the link that Katie is posting in the chat box now. If you have any questions or problems, either regarding registration or attendance, you can see the help email address listed in the attendance notes on the upper left-hand side of the screen. You can contact American English Webinars at elprograms.org with any questions or concerns. So please look for continued helpful instructions from Katie and myself here in the chat box. Again, we only need your information one time in the attendance form that you will see by following the link. Thank you again for joining us today. We're so glad to start this new webinar series, and we look forward to seeing you on February 3rd. Thanks and take care.